called The People Wants, and maybe you can also give us some impression about what happened with this movement in the Arab world, and also some reaction to what we listened about this other movement. And then we could give also some other examples, but first, Gilbert.
Yeah, thank you, Bernard. Well, there's one should say, some kind of imbalance in the way this panel has been organized. It's obviously, I mean, I'm not going to try to tell you the story, this kind of details we heard about the 6 countries which have seen major uprisings in the Arab region. Nor other countries where you had some important social movements. It's just impossible. It would take much time. So what I'm going to do is just address some general issues, and I hope so, issues which can feed into the discussion if we have enough time for a proper discussion. So I'll therefore be brief, although I'm speaking of many countries. That's the way it functions. The first thing is that we are seeing, I mean, of course, some kind of convergence globally, which is illustrated by the fact that we have had several movements in several countries, and started by referring, for instance, to Spain, Greece, and the movements that were represented here in this panel. There are connections. I mean, there is some reason why you have multiplication of movements at a certain period in time. It's, obviously, I would say, connected to the global economic crisis, which is exacerbating a lot of tensions in several countries. That's one probably common factor in explaining this convergence. Another part of the convergence in the forms of the movements, in the forms of organizations of the movement, is related to the fact that they are contemporary of the same technologies. And of course, movements use whatever available technologies there are. And of course, Facebook or the internet or all that have been decisive nowadays. For the last 10 to 15 years, they have been more and more crucial in the forms of organizations that we have seen in various forms of protest, of social protest, social movement, the global justice movement, the peace movement, and the rest. But beyond this kind of convergence, we have to keep in mind the fact that you have different issues and different character of movements, different depths, different types of crises. So we have, for instance, movements which start on specific issues and remain, I would say, limited to one part of society, some kind of protest, like, for instance, the Turkish case, or even the case of Brazil. We have movements where the popular, the movement which turned into a popular protest for the overthrow of a government, in the belief also that they have a solution to the rest of the problems, although you have very big problems, but they have a solution to the rest of the problems in joining the European Union, and that's very much the case of Ukraine, where this issue of the European Union was one of the key triggers of the whole movement. In the Arab world, you have a much deeper crisis than in any of the countries that we mentioned. If we look at the social economic background of the crisis, we look at the kind of dictatorships that you have, much more vicious, much more repressive kind of dictatorships, and they have been there for several decades. It's not like Eastern Europe, which already had some kind of big change in the late 80s, early 90s. So you have had, that's why you have had a movement which, very quickly in the region came with a slogan, one of the central slogans, the people want to overthrow the regime. So it's a very radical kind of demand, a very radical kind of movement which comes immediately to the fore. And it's a movement for regime change, not only in the political sense of the regime, but also a movement for social justice, for social demands which were very much at the center of that. And this leads me to a second point, which is the movement at the beginning was portrayed, especially in the global media, Western media, global media, as, well, some form of repetition of what happened in Eastern Europe in the early 90s or late 80s. Hence the term Arab Spring, the idea being that this would be a short-term kind of change, a democratic transition, as they would call it, which would end with, free elections, new constitution, and that's the end of it. Well, that was a kind of illusory perception of the events. And this was also connected to the idea that this is a youth rebellion, with other terms like Facebook revolution and all that, which was only about, more democratic regime, period, and nothing else. And this fed also into views of the new social movements that are different from the old social movements, which were based on economic demands, on worker struggles, and all that. Well, this view is false, very simply false. 3 of the 6 countries which have seen a major uprising in the region are countries where you have important social workers' movements, and 2 of them, and the 2. It's not a coincidence. The 2 countries where everything started are countries which have had very important worker struggles, social struggles in the years preceding 2011 or December 2010 when it started in Tunisia. In Tunisia, you had a series of regional uprisings, several regional uprisings over the years, over the 2000s, until the one which was also a regional uprising initially in Sidi Bouzid in the center of the country, which turned, because of some accumulation of tension, into, spread to the other regions and then to the capital and led to the events that you know. Egypt is and this movement in Tunisia was the key organizing force of the whole movement in Tunisia was not Facebook, was the General Union of Tunisian Workers, which is, in relative terms, the strongest and the most relatively autonomous union movement you have in the whole Arab world. If you move to Egypt, the 2011 uprising was preceded by the most important wave of worker strikes in the history of the country. And starting from 2004, 2005, you had a huge wave of worker strikes with hundreds of thousands of workers going into every type of strikes or industrial actions of all sorts. And this was the real precursor. This is what prepared the ground for the uprising, not to mention the fact that in the uprising itself, especially the last days before the overthrow of Mubarak, we have seen a flare-up in worker struggles and a kind of general strike spreading to the country. So, this is just to emphasize this fact, but also it also shows, the countries where you have the possibility of, you have the existence of a workers' movement or the possibility of the accumulation of worker struggles are the countries where you had the most powerful movement in terms of popularity and threat. And, it wasn't possible in all countries to have experiences of social struggles. Some of the countries of the region are countries where any attempt at any form of social struggle is met with terrible repression. And when I say terrible repression, I mean terrible repression, which means at the very minimum torture, jail for indefinite time, the most brutal kind of torture you can imagine, and this is when you are not killed by bullets or whatever. And this is the case in countries like Libya and Syria. Is the case if ever you have, we will see in the future a movement in the country like the Saudi Kingdom, for instance, or many of these monarchies, you can be sure that it will be met with utmost violence. And here, this brings me to my last point, which is very directly connected to the whole theme of this conference, peace and non-violence and the rest. Just to say that the region illustrates the fact that a non-violent strategy is something very good, but for it to work, you need to be facing forces with some limitation to their violence. If you are facing a government or a regime like the Syrian one, which is showing the whole world that it doesn't hesitate to destroy its own country, literally. I mean, I don't think that there has been in history the case of a government destroying its own country with its aviation and all that in this way. We have seen that in international wars, but not in a civil war to that extent. A government which is willing to kill its population by the tens of thousands, and with the accumulation you get in the hundreds of thousands, then you have a big problem. And the fact is that all over the region, the initial inspiration from Tunisia and then Egypt was about the possibility of overthrowing government through peaceful means. Hence the slogan, peaceful, peaceful, Silmiya, Silmiya, which was in Tahrir, in Egypt, and which we saw even in Syria for several weeks and even months. The movement in Syria, led by young people and the rest, which was developing in the form of night demonstrations to avoid the security services' ability to spot who is demonstrating and the rest. You had all this, and you had strong hope that it could be, it could lead to the same result as in Tunisia and Egypt. Now, this proved to be an illusion, and an illusion because there is a major difference between a case like Egypt, for instance, where the army actually, the army is willing to get rid of the ruler of the moment in order to perpetuate its own rule, because it's the army as an institution that is ruling, and hence you had the kind of changes you had in Egypt. But there you had another illusion, the illusion that by overthrowing Mubarak you had won, the revolution had won, and we can now see when we turn to Egypt how much this was also an illusion. The deep state, as they started calling it many years ago in Turkey, is very much there, and the regime has not changed. But if you turn to countries like Libya or Syria, you don't even have this kind of situation, because there is no institution that is autonomous from the ruling family. You have ruling families, and they have turned the repressive forces of the country into a private guard, into what is called a Praetorian Guard, if you want. It is a private guard of the regime, and the regime will use this private guard in order to preserve itself. And that's why, after a while, the movement in Syria, for instance, which started, as I said, wanting to be or to remain a peaceful movement, was faced with an intensification and an escalation in the violence and the destruction of by the regime after the initial few months, to the point that the choice people faced was either to surrender, but surrendering is not possible in a country like that, because then you face torture and terrible consequences, or to defend yourself. You can't expect people to keep, presenting themselves or their breasts to bullets. You can do that if you believe that there is some possibility that, again, as I said, that those facing you will be inhibited in shooting at you. But when you are facing people who don't have any inhibition in shooting at crowds, then you have a big problem. And this is to say that the idea that the Syrian people, for instance, the Syrian opposition, made a mistake, as is sometimes said in turning to military defense, I think it's profoundly mistaken in the sense that when they did not anyhow have a choice, there was no choice left by the kind of regime and repression that they were facing. So I will end just by saying, since I said that the regime essentially did not change, well, at the level of the region, and we can see here the effect of the examples set by Tunisia and Egypt and to the rest of the world, including Spain or even the United States, where some people the Occupy movement also referred to the occupation of squares that you had in Egypt and all that. What we can say, if we had to summarize the balance sheet of what's happening now in the region, well, it would be, this is a slogan that was on the walls in Cairo: the regime did not change, but the people changed. And that's very important. The people changed in the sense that they are no longer willing to accept resignation and submission to injustice. The issue is here. People have discovered that when they come out in the street and want to impose their will, they can do so, sometimes at a terrible price, of course, and that's also the price of the lack of organization, but that's how history is. Not all revolutions are peaceful, far from it. Thank you very much.